To the old lady who's finally going to make room for the next generation, my daughter-in-law Ashley said as she raised her glass across the table, smiling like she had just told the sweetest joke in the world. The room filled with polite laughter, the kind people make when they're not sure whether something is funny or uncomfortable. I lifted my own glass and smiled back, the way a woman does after 72 years of learning when silence is more powerful than words. The restaurant was bright that afternoon, sunlight pouring through the wide windows and reflecting off the polished wood tables. Balloons in blue and silver floated above the corner booth where my family had gathered to celebrate my grandson Lucas's 10th birthday. The waiter had just brought out the cake, a chocolate one with thick frosting and a row of tiny baseball decorations because Lucas had just joined his Little League team this spring. 10 candles waited to be lit, and Lucas was bouncing in his seat with the restless excitement only a 10-year-old boy can have. It should have been a simple afternoon, the kind of family moment that warms your heart later when you remember it. But Ashley's toast hung in the air like a faint echo that no one quite knew how to respond to. I glanced at my son Daniel, who sat beside her. He was staring down at his iced tea, turning the glass slowly between his fingers as if he were studying the condensation. Daniel had always been terrible at hiding discomfort. Even as a little boy he could never meet your eyes when he felt guilty about something. Ashley took a small sip from her wine glass and set it down carefully, her smile still perfectly in place. She had that way about her, polished and confident, the kind of woman who always looked as if she had stepped out of a magazine. Her blonde hair was pinned neatly behind her shoulders, and the diamond bracelet Daniel had given her last Christmas sparkled every time she moved her hand. "Oh, come on," she added lightly, glancing around the table. "You know I'm joking." My sister Ruth gave a small chuckle. Daniel finally forced a smile. Lucas, blissfully unaware of adult tension, leaned forward and blew air across the unlit candles as if practicing for the real moment. I raised my glass slightly toward Ashley. "To Lucas," I said calmly. 10 years old already. That's something worth celebrating. My voice sounded steady, even to my own ears. After a lifetime of raising a son, caring for a husband, and running a home that had stood on the same quiet street in Fairfield County for over 40 years, you learn how to keep your dignity in public. The waiter returned and began lighting the candles one by one. Tiny flames flickered in the soft afternoon light. Lucas grinned widely, his brown hair falling into his eyes just like Daniel's used to when he was that age. For a moment the conversation returned to normal. Someone asked Lucas about baseball practice. Ruth commented on the cake decorations. Ashley scrolled briefly through her phone before sliding it back into her purse. But I could still feel the weight of her words lingering in the room. Make room for the next generation. It was an odd thing to say, even as a joke. Especially the way she had looked at me when she said it. Not angry. Not hostile. Just certain. The way people speak when they already believe the future is decided. I cut a small piece of cake and placed it on Lucas's plate after he blew out the candles to a round of applause. He immediately began eating with the enthusiasm of someone who had been thinking about chocolate frosting for hours. "Best birthday ever," he announced through a mouthful of cake. I reached over and wiped a bit of frosting from his cheek with a napkin. "Careful," I said softly. "Your mother will say I'm spoiling you again." Ashley laughed lightly at that, though something about the sound felt practiced. "Oh, Margaret," she said. "You always did have a soft spot for him." Always did. The phrase caught my attention. Not have. Did, another small thing, easily ignored if you weren't paying attention. Daniel cleared his throat. "Mom," he said, finally looking at me. "Did you find the place okay? Traffic can be crazy around here on Saturdays." "I've been driving in this town since before you had your learner's permit," I replied with a gentle smile. I managed. That earned a real laugh from Ruth, and the tension loosened for a moment. But as the lunch continued, I noticed the little glances Ashley kept exchanging with Daniel. The way she occasionally checked her watch. The way Daniel seemed unusually quiet, answering questions in short sentences and then drifting back into silence. After 40 years of marriage, my late husband Robert had taught me something important about people. Most secrets reveal themselves not through dramatic confessions but through small inconsistencies. The things people say when they think no one is really listening. Or the things they stop saying altogether. When the bill finally came, Daniel reached for it automatically. "I've got it," he said. "It's Lucas's birthday." Ashley stood and adjusted her coat, smoothing the fabric across her shoulders. "Well," she said brightly, glancing back at me. "Let's just say the next birthday party might look a little different." Again, that smile. Again, that certainty. I picked up my purse and rose from the table slowly. At 72, I had learned something Ashley clearly hadn't realized yet. Sometimes the person everyone assumes is fragile is actually the one who has been quietly paying attention the entire time. And sometimes the quietest person at the table is the one holding the strongest cards. I drove home from the restaurant slowly that afternoon, the late spring sun stretching long shadows across the quiet streets of Fairfield County. Traffic was light, and the familiar houses passed by one after another, each with its neat lawns and white fences, the kind of neighborhood where people still waved when you drove past. I had lived here for more than 4 decades. Long enough to remember when most of the trees along these streets were barely taller than the mailboxes. Long enough to know that nothing about a family ever changes all at once. It always happens slowly, piece by piece, like the shifting of seasons. Ashley's words from the lunch replayed quietly in my mind. To the old lady who is finally going to make room for the next generation. The way she said it had not sounded careless. It sounded rehearsed. Like a line from a conversation that had already been discussed somewhere else. I pulled into my driveway and turned off the engine, sitting there for a moment with my hands resting on the steering wheel. My house stood exactly the way it always had. A wide gray colonial with white shutters and a front porch that Robert had insisted on building even though the contractor told him it would cost more than planned. Robert always said a house should have a place where people could sit and watch the world go by. I stepped out of the car and walked up the small brick path toward the front door. The garden beds along the porch were already beginning to bloom. Tulips in red and yellow stood in neat rows beside the hydrangea bushes Robert had planted years ago. I still watered them every morning. Not because anyone expected me to, but because some habits become part of the way you live your life. Inside the house the air was quiet and still. I placed my purse on the small wooden table near the door and hung my coat in the closet. The living room looked exactly as it had that morning. The same blue sofa. The same framed photographs along the mantel. Robert's old reading chair still sat near the window, angled toward the afternoon light. I walked over and ran my hand along the back of it. It had been 3 years since Robert passed away, but sometimes the house still felt as though he had simply stepped outside for a moment. I moved into the kitchen and poured myself a glass of water. Through the window above the sink I could see the backyard stretching toward the tall maple trees that lined the property. Daniel had built a small treehouse out there when he was 10 years old. Robert had helped him hammer the boards together one Saturday morning while I watched from the porch with a cup of coffee. Daniel had been so proud of that little structure. He insisted it was strong enough to survive a hurricane. I smiled faintly at the memory. Daniel used to run through this house like a storm of energy. Back then he would burst through the door after school and head straight for the kitchen, asking what was for dinner before he even put down his backpack. He used to tell me everything. About baseball practice. About teachers he liked. About the girl in his math class who always beat him on tests. Somewhere along the way those conversations grew shorter. That happens in every family. Children grow up, build lives of their own, and their worlds become larger than the homes they came from. But lately the distance had felt different. Not natural. Intentional. I carried the glass of water into the living room and sat down slowly on the edge of the sofa. My eyes drifted toward the large framed photograph hanging above the fireplace. Robert and I stood together in that picture on our 30th wedding anniversary. He had his arm around my shoulders and that calm expression he always carried, the look of a man who believed the world made sense if you paid attention to it long enough. Robert had trusted people easily, but he also noticed things others missed. I could almost hear his voice in my memory now, steady and thoughtful the way it always was. "Margaret," he once said years ago, not long after Daniel and Ashley started dating seriously. "That young woman is very charming. But charm is not the same thing as kindness." At the time I thought he was simply being protective of Daniel. Ashley had seemed perfectly pleasant when I first met her. She was confident, well-dressed, polite in that careful way some people learn early in life. Over the years she had hosted beautiful holiday dinners and organized family gatherings with impressive efficiency. Everyone admired how capable she was. But Robert watched people differently. He believed character revealed itself in the quiet spaces between conversations. I finished the glass of water and placed it on the coffee table. The house felt unusually quiet that afternoon. Outside a breeze rustled the leaves of the maple trees, creating a soft whispering sound through the open window. I leaned back against the sofa and closed my eyes for a moment. Ashley's voice returned again in my memory, cheerful and light as she raised that glass across the restaurant table. "To the old lady who is finally going to make room for the next generation." Most people might have brushed it aside as an awkward joke. But after 72 years you learn to recognize the difference between humor and intention. The difference between a careless remark and a preview of something already being planned. And as I sat there in the quiet living room of the house Robert and I built together, I began to realize something very simple. Ashley had not been teasing. She had been announcing something she believed was already decided. I remained seated in the living room for a long time that afternoon, watching the soft movement of the tree branches outside the window. The sun had shifted slightly lower, casting long lines of light across the hardwood floor that Robert had insisted on installing himself nearly 20 years ago. I could still remember the weekend he spent measuring each plank twice before placing it down. He used to say that if you wanted something to last, you had to build it carefully the first time. That was Robert. Patient. Observant. Never rushed by the noise of the moment. I slowly stood and walked toward the hallway where our study had always been. Most people would call it a small office, but Robert preferred the word study because he believed a home should have at least one room dedicated to quiet thinking. The door creaked softly as I opened it. Nothing inside had changed much since he passed away 3 years earlier. His desk sat exactly where it always had, facing the tall window that looked out toward the backyard. A simple wooden desk, worn smooth by decades of use. Robert had handled most of our financial papers there, keeping everything organized in neat folders with small handwritten labels. I did not often go through those files. Not because I could not, but because I had always trusted the system he created. Robert believed in planning ahead. He used to say that uncertainty is the one thing that causes families to argue. A good plan, he believed, prevents misunderstandings before they ever begin. I opened the desk drawer slowly and pulled out one of the old file folders. The paper felt thick and slightly yellowed with time. Robert's handwriting covered the tab at the top in his steady block letters. I placed the folder on the desk and sat down in his chair, letting the quiet of the room settle around me. Outside, a lawn mower started somewhere down the street, its distant hum blending with the occasional chirp of birds in the maple trees. I thought again about Ashley's toast at the restaurant. Not the words alone, but the confidence behind them. She had spoken as though the future was already arranged, as though everyone at that table understood something that had never been discussed with me. That kind of certainty does not come from imagination. It comes from conversation. From plans made behind closed doors. My eyes drifted toward the framed photograph sitting on the corner of Robert's desk. It was taken on a summer afternoon years ago, when Daniel graduated from college. Daniel stood between Robert and me, wearing his cap and gown, smiling with the bright optimism of someone who believed life was just beginning to open. Robert had one hand on Daniel's shoulder in that picture, the way fathers do when they are quietly proud but trying not to make a scene about it. I picked up the photograph for a moment and studied Robert's expression. Calm. Thoughtful. The same way he always looked when he was considering something carefully. Robert had never disliked Ashley openly. He was too polite for that. But I remembered several evenings early in Daniel's marriage when Robert would sit at the kitchen table after Ashley left the room and simply watch the door for a moment before speaking. One night he said something that stayed with me longer than I realized at the time. "Margaret," he said gently, folding his reading glasses and placing them beside his coffee cup, "some people are very skilled at creating the appearance of harmony. But appearances are often designed for a purpose." At the time I had laughed softly and told him he was being overly cautious. Ashley was ambitious and organized, yes, but she was also Daniel's wife. Families adjust to new personalities all the time. Robert only nodded and let the conversation drift elsewhere. That was his way. He never argued loudly. He simply noticed things and stored them quietly in the back of his mind. I placed the photograph back on the desk and opened the file folder again. Inside were several documents, neatly arranged the way Robert always kept them. Legal papers, property records, insurance forms. Each page carefully dated. I was not searching for anything in particular. Not yet. But something about Ashley's words had stirred a faint instinct that Robert himself used to rely on often. When something does not feel right, he once told me, do not rush to confront it. First understand it. I leaned back slightly in the chair and looked around the small study again. The room smelled faintly of old paper and cedar from the bookshelf that lined the far wall. This room had always been Robert's quiet command center, the place where he handled the practical side of life while the rest of the house carried on with ordinary routines. I suddenly realized something that made me pause. Robert had never been careless about protecting the things he built. Not the house. Not our finances. And certainly not the future of the woman he shared 40 years with. Ashley may have believed she understood the situation completely. She may have believed that time alone would eventually move me aside, the way people assume older generations naturally step away. But Robert Whitmore was not the kind of man who left important matters to assumption. And as I sat there in his chair with the quiet afternoon light filling the room, I began to suspect that the plans Ashley thought she understood might not be the only plans Robert had ever made. I remained seated in Robert's chair for several minutes, listening to the quiet rhythm of the house around me. The late afternoon sun had shifted again, casting a warm band of light across the surface of the desk. Dust motes drifted slowly through the air, visible only when they crossed that strip of sunlight. Robert used to say that the study was the calmest room in the house because it faced the backyard instead of the street. No traffic, no noise, only the steady movement of the trees and the occasional sound of wind through the branches. I opened another folder from the stack inside the drawer, moving slowly and carefully the way Robert always had. Each document was placed with deliberate precision. Property tax records, insurance policies, investment statements. Robert had always believed that clarity prevented conflict. If everything is written down clearly, he once told me during one of our quiet evenings at the kitchen table, then no one has to argue about what was meant. I turned one page after another, noticing how each year was labeled in his careful handwriting. Robert's handwriting never changed much over time. Even in the final years of his life, when his hands moved more slowly than they used to, each letter remained steady and deliberate. It was the handwriting of a man who never rushed important decisions. As I continued reading through the documents, my mind drifted back to the first time Ashley visited our home. Daniel had brought her over on a crisp autumn evening nearly 15 years ago. She arrived carrying a small bouquet of white flowers and a polite smile that never quite reached her eyes. I remember Robert standing near the doorway as they walked inside. He greeted her warmly, of course. Robert always treated guests with quiet respect. But later that night, after Daniel drove Ashley back to her apartment, Robert sat at the kitchen table longer than usual, stirring his coffee slowly. "She is very confident," he said finally. I smiled at the time and said that confidence was not a bad quality for a young woman building a career. Robert nodded thoughtfully but did not argue. That was his way. He never pushed his opinions too strongly. Instead, he watched how people behaved when they believed no one was paying attention. Over the years, Ashley became a constant presence in our lives. Holiday dinners were organized by her carefully planned schedules. Family photos were arranged with precise coordination. She always seemed to know how every event should unfold. Many people admired that kind of control. They called it leadership. But Robert sometimes watched those moments with a quiet expression that I did not fully understand until much later. One evening not long before he passed away, Robert and I sat together on the porch as the sun set behind the maple trees. The air smelled faintly of fresh cut grass, and Daniel had just left after visiting with Lucas. Robert looked out across the yard for a long moment before speaking. "Margaret," he said gently, "Daniel is a good man. But good men sometimes trust the wrong person to guide them." I asked him what he meant, but he only gave that small thoughtful smile and said that time reveals character more clearly than any conversation. At the time I believed he was simply being cautious. Robert had always been careful about the future. But sitting in his study now, with the quiet weight of those documents in my hands, I began to see his concerns in a different light. I reached deeper into the folder and pulled out a thicker set of papers held together by a metal clip. The first page was printed on heavier paper, the kind used for formal legal documents. Robert had always kept the most important records together in one place. I placed the papers flat on the desk and read the title slowly. It was a legal agreement connected to the house and several financial accounts Robert managed before he passed away. The language was formal and precise, written in the careful structure lawyers prefer. But even without reading every detail immediately, I could recognize Robert's intention behind the arrangement. He had not simply left things to chance. He had created a structure designed to protect what we built together. I leaned back slightly in the chair and looked once more toward the window. Outside, the backyard stretched peacefully beneath the late afternoon light. The maple trees swayed gently in the breeze, just as they had for decades. Somewhere in the distance a dog barked and then fell silent again. Everything looked exactly the same as it had that morning when I left for Lucas's birthday lunch. Yet something inside me had shifted quietly during the past few hours. Ashley may have believed that the future of this house had already been decided. She may have believed that time alone would eventually move me aside and place everything into the hands of the next generation. But Robert Whitmore was not a man who trusted the future to assumptions. And as I carefully closed the folder and rested my hand on the edge of his desk, I realized that the calm confidence Ashley showed at that restaurant might not have been based on the full truth of the situation. Because the more I looked through the plans Robert had quietly arranged, the more it became clear that my husband had anticipated something long before anyone else noticed it. And if Robert had indeed prepared for the possibility that someone might try to control the future of this home, then Ashley's confident toast earlier that afternoon might have been based on a misunderstanding far larger than she ever imagined. I sat in Robert's study for a long time after closing the folder, my fingers resting lightly on the edge of the desk as the quiet of the house settled around me again. The sun had lowered enough now that the light coming through the window had softened, turning the backyard into a patchwork of gold and shadow beneath the tall maple trees. For more than 40 years that yard had been the center of our family life. Daniel learned to ride his bicycle along the narrow stone path near the garden fence. Lucas took his first steps on that same grass during a summer barbecue when he was barely 1 year old. Every memory in this house was layered carefully on top of the last, like the rings inside an old tree. And Robert had understood that better than anyone. I opened the folder again, this time reading the first pages more carefully. The legal language was clear, though formal, the way attorneys often write when they want every detail to leave no room for confusion. Robert had created something called a family trust several years before his passing. I remembered the day he told me he was meeting with his attorney about updating some paperwork, but at the time I had not asked many questions. Robert handled those matters with quiet confidence, and I trusted his judgment the same way I trusted the strength of the walls he built around this home. As I continued reading, one sentence caught my attention and held it firmly. The trust named me as the primary trustee. Not temporarily. Not symbolically. Completely. Which meant the responsibility for every major decision connected to the property and several financial accounts remained entirely in my hands unless I chose otherwise. I leaned back slowly in the chair, letting that information settle in my mind. Ashley's confident tone at the restaurant returned again, as clear as if she were standing in the room beside me. To the old lady who is finally going to make room for the next generation. I could see now how she might have arrived at that assumption. Many people believe that when someone reaches a certain age, decisions quietly shift to younger hands without much discussion. It is a common belief in families where no one has taken the time to look closely at the details. But Robert never trusted common assumptions. He trusted preparation. I turned another page and found a letter clipped neatly behind the official documents. The envelope had been opened before, but the paper inside still held the faint scent of the cedar drawer where Robert used to keep his personal correspondence. I recognized his handwriting immediately. Robert had written the letter only a few months before he passed away. I unfolded the page slowly and read the first line. Margaret, if you are reading this, then it means I was right about one thing. Time has a way of revealing people's intentions. I paused there for a moment, feeling the quiet weight of his words. Robert was not the kind of man who wrote dramatic messages. Every sentence he put on paper had a purpose. The letter was not long, but it was thoughtful. Robert explained that he had structured the trust carefully so that the house and several related assets would remain protected under my authority for as long as I wished to live here. No one else could force the sale of the property or move me into a different living arrangement without my consent. Even Daniel, whom Robert loved deeply, would not have the legal authority to override those decisions. Robert wrote that he trusted Daniel's heart but worried about the influence of stronger personalities surrounding him. I could almost hear his calm voice as I read the final lines. You have always been stronger than people realize, Margaret. Do not allow anyone to convince you otherwise simply because the years have passed. I folded the letter carefully and placed it back on the desk. Outside the sky had begun to shift toward early evening, and the air moving through the open window carried the faint scent of freshly cut grass from somewhere down the street. I thought again about Ashley's smile at the restaurant and the quiet glances she exchanged with Daniel across the table. She believed the future of this house had already been decided. She believed time would naturally move me aside so that the next generation could take control of what Robert and I spent a lifetime building. But Ashley had made one important mistake. She assumed the story had already reached its final chapter. What she did not know was that Robert Whitmore had written the rules of this story long before she ever raised that glass at Lucas's birthday lunch. And those rules were still quietly waiting inside the very documents resting on the desk in front of me. I remained in Robert's study until the light outside faded from gold to the softer gray of early evening. The quiet in the room felt different now, not empty the way it sometimes had since Robert passed away, but steady. Almost reassuring. The letter still rested on the desk beside the trust documents, and I read it once more before carefully placing it back inside the folder. Robert had always believed that the truth reveals itself slowly, the way dawn moves across a field. At first you see only shadows, and then gradually the shapes become clearer. Ashley's confidence at the restaurant earlier that day made sense now. But only from her perspective. She believed that time alone would push me toward a smaller apartment, a retirement community, or perhaps one of those assisted living residences that advertise comfort and convenience to people who have not asked for either. Many families assume that is the natural direction of things. The older generation steps aside. The younger generation reorganizes the pieces. But Robert had built our lives with far more intention than that. I closed the folder and returned it to the drawer, leaving the letter on the desk for a moment longer. Outside the sky had turned a pale blue-gray, and the porch light near the front door had already clicked on automatically. I stood and walked slowly back through the hallway into the living room. The house was quiet except for the faint ticking of the clock above the fireplace. That clock had been a wedding gift from Robert's parents when we married 43 years ago. It had measured every stage of our lives together, from the nights when Daniel was a newborn waking every few hours to the calm evenings when Robert and I would sit together reading in comfortable silence. I poured myself a cup of tea in the kitchen and carried it to the porch. The evening air was cool and carried the faint scent of lilacs from the garden along the fence. I sat in the old wooden chair Robert built years ago and looked across the yard toward the darkening line of maple trees. Somewhere a cricket had begun its steady rhythm in the grass. My thoughts returned again to Daniel. My son had always been kind at heart. Even as a boy he disliked conflict. When two classmates argued during recess, Daniel was the child who tried to smooth things over rather than choose sides. That gentle nature made him a good husband and father in many ways, but it also meant he sometimes allowed stronger personalities to shape decisions around him. Ashley was very good at shaping decisions. I remembered the way she had spoken during lunch. Calm. Certain. As though everyone already understood what the next step would be. Make room for the next generation. The phrase was not cruel in tone, but it carried the quiet assumption that my role in this home was temporary now. I sipped the tea slowly and allowed the silence of the evening to settle around me. Robert's letter had changed something inside me. Not in a dramatic way, but in a steady, grounding way. For 3 years after Robert's passing I had tried to move gently through life, avoiding unnecessary conflict with Daniel and Ashley. I told myself that families sometimes need time to find their balance after a loss. But Robert had seen something I chose not to recognize fully. Preparation was not the same thing as suspicion. It was simply wisdom. I set the empty cup on the small table beside the porch chair and watched the last light fade behind the trees. Ashley believed the future of this house had already been arranged. She believed that a polite conversation or two would eventually guide me toward leaving the place Robert and I built together. What she did not understand was that Robert had already given me the authority to decide exactly how that future would unfold. No one could force a sale. No one could quietly transfer control behind a series of friendly discussions. Every path forward required my agreement. An agreement was something I had not yet been asked to give. The porch light cast a warm circle across the wooden boards beneath my feet as night settled over the neighborhood. A car passed slowly along the street, its headlights sweeping briefly across the trees before disappearing around the corner. I stood after a while and returned inside, closing the porch door gently behind me. The study light still glowed softly down the hallway where Robert's desk waited. Tomorrow, I thought, there were a few phone calls I should probably make. Not because I felt angry or threatened. Robert had taught me long ago that the strongest response to uncertainty is not emotion but clarity. Ashley had raised her glass earlier that afternoon believing the story of this house was already moving toward its conclusion. But the truth was much simpler than that. The story had never been hers to write in the first place. I woke early the next morning the way I often did since Robert passed away. The house was still quiet, wrapped in that soft gray light that arrives just before sunrise. For a moment I lay in bed listening to the familiar sounds of the neighborhood waking up slowly. Somewhere down the street a garage door opened. A car engine started. And faded into the distance. The maple trees outside my bedroom window moved gently in the breeze, their leaves whispering together like they had done for decades. I sat up slowly and looked around the room that Robert and I shared for most of our adult lives. His side of the bed remained exactly the way I had left it, the small wooden nightstand still holding the lamp he liked to read by late in the evenings. Losing Robert had been the hardest quiet I ever learned to live with, but over time that quiet had become something steady rather than painful. I dressed and walked downstairs, moving through the house with the familiar rhythm of morning routines. The kitchen windows faced east, and by the time I poured my first cup of coffee the rising sun had begun to color the sky above the trees in soft shades of orange and pale blue. I carried the mug to the small table near the window and sat down, letting the warmth of the coffee settle into my hands. The events of the previous afternoon returned clearly to my mind, but without the tension that might have followed for someone else. Robert had always believed that clarity removes the need for anxiety. Once you understand the structure of a situation, the next steps become simple. I finished the coffee and walked down the hallway toward the study again. The folder and Robert's letter were still exactly where I left them on the desk. I read the letter once more, not because I needed to confirm the facts but because hearing Robert's voice in those careful sentences brought a sense of calm determination. After placing the papers neatly back into the drawer, I sat down at the desk and reached for the telephone. There was one person Robert trusted deeply whenever legal matters required careful attention. His attorney, Thomas Caldwell, had worked with our family for nearly 20 years. Thomas was not the kind of lawyer who chased dramatic courtroom battles. He preferred quiet preparation and precise documentation, the same qualities Robert valued in almost everything. I dialed the number slowly and waited while the phone rang twice before a familiar voice answered. Thomas sounded surprised but pleased to hear from me so early in the morning. We exchanged a few polite words about how the neighborhood had changed over the years. Before I mentioned that I had been reviewing some of Robert's files the evening before. Thomas listened carefully as I explained what I had found. His response was calm, almost reassuring. He confirmed that the trust Robert established remained exactly as described in the documents. I retained full authority over the house and the related financial accounts. No transfer of ownership, no sale, and no major change could occur without my direct approval. Thomas also reminded me that Robert had asked him to remain available if I ever wished to review the arrangement in greater detail. We agreed that I would stop by his office later that week simply to confirm that everything remained properly documented and up to date. The conversation lasted only a few minutes, but when I placed the receiver back on the desk I felt a quiet sense of completion settle into the room. The facts were clear. The legal structure Robert created remained intact. Ashley's confidence at the restaurant had been built entirely on assumptions rather than reality. I stood and walked back toward the kitchen just as the morning sun filled the house with warm light. The clock above the fireplace chimed softly, marking the start of another ordinary day. In many ways the house looked exactly the same as it had the day before. The same photographs on the mantel. The same worn chair near the window. The same garden outside beginning to bloom with early summer color. But something inside me had shifted into place during the past 24 hours. Not anger. Not resentment. Simply understanding. Ashley had believed that the future of this house was a matter of timing. She believed that if she waited long enough, circumstances would eventually push me aside. But Robert Whitmore had never trusted timing alone. He trusted preparation. And now that I understood exactly what he had prepared, the path forward no longer felt uncertain at all. Because sometimes the calmest response to someone else's plans is simply knowing that those plans were never truly in their hands to begin with. I spent the rest of that morning moving through the house with a calm focus that had been missing for a long time. Not because anything dramatic had changed overnight, but because uncertainty had quietly disappeared. Robert always believed that once the facts are clear, the mind becomes much calmer. I watered the flowers along the porch railing the way I did every morning, letting the cool water soak slowly into the soil while the sunlight warmed the wooden boards beneath my feet. The neighborhood was fully awake now. A jogger passed along the sidewalk across the street. A school bus stopped at the corner to collect a group of children. Life continued with the steady rhythm of an ordinary weekday. Inside the house I tidied the kitchen, rinsed my coffee cup, and placed it on the drying rack beside the sink. The phone remained silent on the counter for most of the morning, which did not surprise me. Ashley was not the type of person who rushed a conversation she believed she could control later. She preferred timing. Careful positioning. A calm discussion presented as concern. Around mid-afternoon the call finally came. Daniel's name appeared on the screen, and I answered with the same steady tone I used whenever he called. My son sounded relaxed at first, asking how I was feeling after the birthday lunch the day before. His voice carried the gentle hesitation of someone preparing to introduce a topic carefully. After a few moments of ordinary conversation, he mentioned that he and Ashley had been thinking about the future of the house. He spoke slowly, choosing each word as though he hoped the sentence would sound helpful rather than intrusive. Daniel said the property was large and required maintenance that might become difficult over time. He suggested that perhaps it would be easier if I considered a smaller place somewhere nearby. A condominium, he said, or maybe one of those modern retirement communities that offered convenient services and organized activities. I listened quietly without interrupting him. The suggestion itself was not surprising. In fact, it sounded almost exactly like the plan Ashley must have been discussing privately for some time. When Daniel finished speaking, there was a small pause on the line. I could almost imagine Ashley standing somewhere nearby, waiting to hear my response. I spoke gently. I told Daniel that I appreciated his concern, and that I understood he wanted what he believed was best for me. Then I explained something simple. I said that Robert had arranged the legal structure of the house very carefully before he passed away. I explained that the property was protected under a family trust and that I remained the sole trustee with full authority over every decision connected to the house. Daniel was quiet for several seconds after hearing that. I could hear him breathing slowly as he processed the information. I did not say it in a confrontational way. There was no reason to create tension where clarity would do the work much more effectively. Finally Daniel spoke again, asking whether that meant no changes could be made unless I personally approved them. I told him that was correct. Robert had created the arrangement specifically to ensure that no one would ever feel pressured to leave the home we built together. There was another brief silence, longer this time. When Daniel spoke again, his voice sounded thoughtful rather than defensive. He said he did not realize Robert had structured things that way. I told him that many people did not realize it because Robert believed important protections should remain quiet until they were actually needed. The conversation ended politely a few minutes later. Daniel said he would talk with Ashley and that we could all sit down together sometime to discuss the future more openly. After the call ended, I placed the phone back on the kitchen counter and stood for a moment looking out through the window at the backyard. The maple trees moved gently in the afternoon breeze, their leaves flashing green and silver in the sunlight. The house remained exactly the same as it had been the day before. The same rooms. The same memories. The same quiet strength Robert built into its walls over the course of 40 years. Ashley had raised her glass at Lucas's birthday lunch, believing the story of this house was already moving in a certain direction. But what she had not realized was that Robert had written a very different ending long before that moment ever arrived. And sometimes the most powerful response to someone else's plans is not an argument or a confrontation. Sometimes it is simply the quiet truth that their plans were never the ones guiding the story in the first place. I woke the next morning to the quiet certainty that nothing in this house had ever belonged to uncertainty. The sunlight filtered gently through the curtains, painting the bedroom walls with a soft glow that reminded me of countless mornings Robert and I had shared together. For a moment I simply sat on the edge of the bed and listened to the stillness. The clock downstairs chimed faintly, the same clock that had marked birthdays, holidays, arguments, laughter, and long peaceful evenings for more than 4 decades. Time moves forward, but some places hold it carefully, like a book that remembers every page ever written. I dressed slowly and walked down the hallway, my hand brushing lightly against the photographs that lined the wall. There was Daniel at age 6 holding a fishing rod twice his height. There was Robert standing proudly beside the half-built porch that would later become his favorite place to sit at sunset. And there was Lucas, only a toddler in that picture, grinning while holding a small plastic shovel in the garden Robert planted years ago. I stepped into the kitchen and poured a cup of coffee, the familiar scent filling the room with quiet comfort. Outside, the yard looked peaceful beneath the clear morning sky. The maple trees swayed gently in the breeze, and the garden Robert once tended with such patience had begun to bloom again. I carried my coffee to the porch and sat in the same chair where Robert and I had spent so many evenings talking about ordinary things. I thought about the conversation with Daniel the day before. His voice had not sounded angry or defensive, only surprised. For years he had assumed the same thing Ashley believed, that time would eventually change the structure of this home without much discussion. But families are not businesses that quietly shift ownership when someone reaches a certain age. Families are built on promises, and Robert had always kept his promises carefully. Late that afternoon Daniel arrived at the house with Lucas. I heard the car pull into the driveway before the doorbell rang, and when I opened the door Lucas rushed inside with the same burst of energy Daniel once had at that age. He ran toward the backyard asking if he could see the old treehouse again. I smiled and told him of course he could, reminding him to watch the loose step near the ladder. Daniel followed more slowly, his expression thoughtful but calm. We sat together at the kitchen table while Lucas explored the yard outside. Daniel looked around the room for a moment, taking in the familiar details of the house where he had grown up. Finally he spoke. He said he had talked with Ashley after our phone call the previous day. At first she had been surprised to learn about the trust Robert created. She believed the property would eventually transfer automatically after enough time had passed. Daniel admitted he had assumed the same thing. I nodded quietly. Many people believe time solves everything, I told him. But Robert believed in preparation. Daniel leaned back slightly in his chair and studied the kitchen window for a moment. The afternoon sunlight reflected softly off the glass, lighting the room the same way it had for decades. After a while he said something that made me smile gently. He said he realized now that Robert had been protecting more than just a house. He had been protecting stability. He had been making sure no one would ever feel pressured to leave the place that held so many years of our lives. Lucas came running back inside a few minutes later, excitedly describing how the treehouse still smelled like old wood and summer air. Daniel laughed softly and watched his son with the same quiet pride Robert once showed watching him. In that moment I realized something important. The story Ashley thought she was shaping was never really about property or control. It was about understanding where the true foundation of a family stands. Robert had built this house with careful hands and patient vision. But the real strength of it was never in the wood or the brick. It was in the promise that no one would be pushed aside simply because time had passed. As the afternoon light stretched across the kitchen floor, I looked around the room that had held 40 years of our family's life and felt a quiet sense of peace settle into my heart. Ashley's toast at Lucas's birthday lunch had been meant to suggest that my place here was temporary. But the truth Robert left behind was much simpler than that. This home was never waiting for me to step aside. It was waiting for the next generation to understand what it truly meant to belong.